Today, I wanted to look at something that I've seen so many times in science fiction. It's the Monofilament Blade, a weapon that consists of a single strand of some material or element, be it carbon nanotubes or something more exotic that can cut through anything with effortless ease. You see this in books like The Three-Body Problem, where a series of monofilaments slices a cargo ship and people into perfect little deli slices, crosses a lock in the Panama Canal. You can see a visual representation in Alita Battle Angel, where Zapan has a blade that slices everything, including his own face. You even see it in video games, where the weapon is almost invariably not as good as it is in literary and television counterparts. But I wanted to take a look at this from a few different perspectives. I'll explain why this fantastic material doesn't work without going into much of the science. Then I will go into the atomic level reasons as to why this doesn't work, the nitty-gritty of how molecules behave, which are more interesting than any piece of literature or media I have seen before. And then, because this all started with literary media and science fiction as my inspiration, I wanted to do a brief exercise and a brainstorming session for new ideas. So first, a monofilament wire. This may sound like some impossibly exotic material constructed atom by atom in a high-pressure environment at thousands of Kelvin, but we've actually already been making them for over a century. It's plastic. Yes, the simple plastics that form toys, clothing, electronics, and even jewelry are all essentially a monofilament when they are first formed. Take polyethylene, for example. Start with a bunch of these little subunits of ethene, react them together, and you get a continuous chain that is hundreds of thousands of units long. A monofilament wire. And this monofilament wire, a science fiction staple, is absolutely awful. Plastic has awful tensile strength. Even superpolymers like Kevlar and Vectran are worse than common metals like steel for their tensile strength. You can try to get around this by using some new material, a special patented mixture made in a top-secret lab, or some new piece of alien superalloy like Skrith from Larry Niven's Ringworld series. But this doesn't work for one simple reason. All these things are made of normal matter. Atoms. I'll explain. Whether something is made of steel, carbon nanotubes, or element X, it interacts with the world with its cloud of electrons that surround the nucleus. And this interaction is weak. If you look at polyethylene from earlier, you'll see that between every atom is a bond. And it is this that has to hold up to the strain and cut through the container ship, person, or massive ring world. But this bond is the same order of magnitude of energy for almost any element, whether it's hydrogen gas, metals, or plastic. So the ease with which a plastic milk jug rips is seen in all materials. The counter to this is, well, why don't we make it thick? Wrap more strands around each other, make the metal into a corded rope. Well, then you don't have a monofilament wire. You have a steel cable, a nylon climbing rope, a piece of fabric. You have a regular blade, and you no longer have a monofilament wire. So you can see, monofilaments aren't impossible to create. They're very easy to make, in fact. It's just that they don't have the mythical properties we see in science fiction. Okay, now that the easy part is over and done with, let's move on to the hard science, and there's a few things I'd like to cover in this. There's the might of carbon nanotubes, which is an excellent counter to everything I said above, but before that, I would like to talk about how bonds break and form before I talk about the weird stuff. I'll start with a very simple example of why monofilaments don't work. Homolytic cleavage. This is the breaking of a bond and the two electrons that make it up, which are evenly divided between either atom. The classic example is the formation of a bromine radical from molecular bromine. The only thing you need for this to happen is ultraviolet light, with some of these reactions only needing lower energy visible light as well. And then you go from a single bond to no bonds with two atoms. This is the simplest example, but it also extends to other atoms. You have ring opening metathesis, in which a double bonded carbon can cleave to form two new double bonded carbons. This process is complicated with many steps that require a catalyst to happen efficiently, but the principle is the same for any atom. A monofilament can cleave when introduced to light of a certain wavelength that can break the chemical bond in two. But why doesn't this happen with plastic? Why can I leave a plastic milk jug outside of my garden and it hasn't turned into dust after a year of harsh sunlight? The simple answer is because it is bulk plastic and can distribute the energy over its many, many molecules. The long answer is that the molecules in close contact with each other can couple to a phonon bath. That's a very dry chemistry term that even I feel unqualified to explain, but here I go. A phonon bath is basically all of the little tiny vibrational states that a molecule experiences because it has thermal energy. This is the macroscopic effect of the quantum phenomenon that states molecules can only have certain discrete energy values, discrete vibrational modes. But when you throw a few 100 trillion carbon and hydrogen atoms right next to each other, you get this nice, smooth distribution of energy. This means that a UV photon that would normally break a bond instead has its energy transferred to this bath of thermal energy that is shared by all of the atoms. It gets hotter. This isn't always the case, as I'll show later, but this is generally true when working in solutions or in bulk solids. However, this can't happen with a single line of atoms. It is a quantum environment in this state, and if a photon of just the right wavelength hits a bond, then the filament snaps in half. This is a serious problem for the polymers I mentioned before, Vectran, which has a single weak ester bond that breaks and renders the entire rest of that specific strand useless. But this is if you have a single chain of atoms that can't absorb energy. What about carbon nanotubes? This is the most effective counterexample, as carbon nanotubes have a ridiculously high tensile strength, above that of even steel, and they are about as close to a single filament in its structure. But there is something tragic about carbon nanotubes, and that is Buckyballs. Buckyballs are the little 60 carbon spheres that resemble a soccer ball. They match the chemical properties of carbon nanotubes very well, with 3 sigma bonds and a pi bond for each carbon. This lines up with the structure of a graphene sheet. With some differences, Buckyballs were thought to be like tiny ball bearings, but when placed underneath a sheet of metal and rolled around, placed under compression, their form completely broke down. It should also be noted that Buckyballs will degrade in the presence of light and become a carcinogen. The same health hazard is also true for carbon nanotubes, but their risk is more closely associated with the characteristics of asbestos, where the fibers get in your eyes and lungs and cause damage to the tissues. You see this in other polymers as well. They are dangerous when isolated, but they are much safer if bound up in something solid or another medium. This is also true for everything from silica to uranium powder. Both of them destroy your lungs when inhaled, but you can enjoy your Windows and Fiesta wear for decades without any worry. But carbon nanotubes aren't Buckyballs. While they have amazing tensile strength, being able to be put under immense tension, they have terrible shear strength, what you would apply if you were to use a blade. This can be remedied by interlinking the layers for a multi-walled carbon nanotube, similar to what you do to increase the strength of plastics, but this greatly increases the diameter of an already wide nanotube. Although this isn't how blades work, as they are already many atoms thick, even at a razor-sharp edge. And even without consideration for the shear stresses, you have terrible compressive strength. The nanotube is basically a limp wire that needs to be held taut and will become a piece of invisible string blowing in the wind otherwise. So while carbon nanotubes are a strong counterexample, they still fall short of being a true monofilament. They are multiple atoms wide and would need to be even thicker to have the shear strain to not immediately break. But don't worry, there's still lots of weird phenomenon that Mother Nature has to offer. I'll give a quick example. Let's say you have a truly infinitely precise carbon nanotube monofilament wire. When you went to cut the steel ship hull, such as in the 3-body problem, your blade would end up getting stuck. This is because your atoms of monofilament are right next to something incredibly reactive, metals in an oxidation state of 0. In the 3-body problem, the wires went through a ship that slowly traveled through a lock. This was a steel hull, but there was also carbon, nickel, manganese, chromium. All of these could, when placed within the distance that a monofilament wire cuts at, end up bonding with the carbon in the wire. There are plenty of electron-rich double bonds that would be more than happy to give an electron to this iron to oxidize, or most of the other trace elements in the hull as well. So while the monofilament should be able to cut anything, we are still within the realm of chemistry, and you've just placed two things right next to each other. These reactions may not normally occur at such normal temperatures. You can't lay a piece of graphite next to an iron bar and have them fuse, but the kinetic energy of the ship is what is supplying the energy to break apart the metal atoms from one another. Cutting metal generates a lot of heat, and not just from friction. Okay, one last thing of weirdness before we get to the exploration of this trope. In the Ringworld series, the builders of the Ringworld made the base of the ring out of skrith, a substance that had the properties of the strong nuclear force. It couldn't be cut by the monofilament wire used by the crew, so naturally, why not make the wire out of the skrith? Well, since they transcended chemical means of making the wire, they are now using nuclear means. And if this has the properties of a nucleus, then it must have the density of the nucleus, and these results actually contradicted what I originally expected. So, if you made a string which was just carbon nuclei touching each other from end to end, ignoring the fact that this would blow apart from the Coulombic forces alone and assuming you don't get a carbon fusion from the massive force of holding two bare nuclei this close together, doing some quick math, a carbon nucleus is 2.7 times 10 to the minus 15 meters across. Laying them end to end to get a meter-long sword would require about 4 times 10 to the 14 atoms. This sounds like a lot, but each atom weighs almost nothing by itself, so your blade would only weigh around 7.4 nanograms in total, which, according to Wikipedia, is the weight of a single birch pollen grain. So, this indestructible super sword that can cut anything and not break would be completely invisible and could be as light as the hilt needed to carry it. I can see why cyborg ninjas in far future civilizations use this thing. But, getting on to the last segment now that we're this far in, how do you use it in a piece of written work like the ones I love so much? The first step is to realize that this is a completely overpowered piece of technology if made possible using fictional means. Normally it acts like a nerfed instant kill weapon that requires you to be right next to someone, but it is possible for this single thing to be the literary equivalent of you playing with your brothers and sisters, and one of them pulls out their everything gun that can go through any shield, is always accurate, is heat-seeking, beats every other everything gun ever made, and can shoot tiny versions of Superman out of it. It becomes really boring and unfun with all this power. So how do you limit this power? Well, let science lead the way. If this is a single filament weapon, then it faces an unrelenting enemy, one in the form of light. We saw this with the Buckyballs earlier. Cast light on them and they break down into a poisonous cloud. So, imagine a sword that can cut through everything and is unbreakable in every way, except for one. The second the blade is unsheathed in the sunlight, it evaporates into a miasmic cloud that suffocates everything around them. This sounds like the perfect blade for an assassin. And since we're working blind in darkness lest our sword disintegrates, how about how dangerous it actually is to ourselves? If this thing even grazes you, or your adventuring party, or your opponent knocks the hilt around, or you drop it, something is getting cut off. A weapon that is as lethal to you as it is to everyone around you is far more interesting of a weapon than the everything gun your little brother kept trying to pull on you. There are a huge number of ways you could tune this little piece of science fiction iconography, from its invisibility to the lethal cloud it makes if it snaps in two. I know Ian M. Banks used it once where it was a simple string until it was held taut between two drones that cut off the spearheads of a marching army. But that's enough of my little screed. I hope you enjoyed and stay tuned for more.